our interest in small economies predates the crises. Small economies, by necessity, have to be highly integrated in the global economy.
It's kind of like a double-edged sword in that regard.
They've got high incomes, they're happy, they've got good social provision. How are they managing it? We shouldn't really be interested in the economic performance and determinants of economic growth. I'm not sure I agree with that. Korea and Taiwan, they succeeded through export-led growth. China has succeeded through export-led growth.
How do you define small economies in this context?
Well, that's opening up a can of worms straight away.
Oh, so my apologies. What made you interested in studying the effects of economic crises on small economies in particular?
Well, our interest in small economies predates the crises, but the important thing about the crises, both the financial crisis started 2008, 2009, and the COVID pandemic 2019 through to 21, is that the specific impacts of these crises were significantly magnified in smaller economies. And the reason for that comes back to the very kind of key economic characteristics of small economies, um, what they specialize in, and the kind of very high level of integration with the global economy, and therefore the high dependence on the economic health of the global economy. There's always these anecdotes about, well, if the United States sneezes, everybody else catches cold. Well,
Yeah.
if the global economy kind of has an itch, then small economies generally get hypothermia.
Mhm.
Okay.
Right.
Um, they are very, very dependent on the global economy, and for a very simple reason. Um, when we talk about small economies, we're really talking about economies with a very small number of people, a limited number of people. They may have large land areas and so on. But one of the challenges with a small number of people is that it's not possible to have very large scale production of almost anything.
Hmm.
When we talk about the success of the East Asian economies, China now, but also Bangladesh, Indonesia, and other economies, and going back in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, Japan, Korea, etc., Taiwan, what we see is mass labor intensive production in manufacturing. And that has never been available for small economies just because there aren't enough people. Um, so, what they've had to do is specialize in areas where they can um, utilize their resources, and their primary resources are people. And occasionally, some of them are lucky enough to have valuable natural resources. We could be talking about oil or um, bauxite, aluminium deposits. That would be Iceland as an example, or fisheries, and so on. Um, and that means that they're highly dependent on very small, very specific sectors. Um, And then we come down to another characteristic. If small economies cannot produce everything that they consume, one of the things, okay, I'm sitting in the UK, I can go down the supermarket and there's a wider range of foodstuffs. I can go anywhere in the shops, I can go on the internet, I can get just about anything. It doesn't matter where they're produced. In a small economy, just about 99% of everything that is consumed has to be imported
Interesting.
because they cannot produce it locally.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Okay? It's just not possible. They can produce some basic foodstuffs depending whereabouts they are in the tropics or in the temperate areas, but they cannot produce consumer goods in general. The problem is, if you have to import all your consumed consumption goods, you have to pay for it somehow. So the only way you can pay for it is finding a niche where you can find markets in elsewhere in the global economy. And of course, you are highly dependent on the success of your kind of um, niche markets and exporting, because if those dry up, you can't pay for consumption. Otherwise, you just build up masses and masses of debt and eventually you become bankrupt.
Hmm.
So, small economies, by necessity, have to be highly integrated in the global economy. So, of course, as soon as there's any sort of kind of crisis or downturn in the global economy, such as is happening at the current moment, um, with the problems in Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East, then markets dry up, consumption goes down, and there that feeds back through into incomes, growth, and the economic well-being very significantly.
Hmm. Yeah.
So the best way to kind of visualize this is that the global economic economy goes in peaks and troughs. Okay, it's not a kind of single linear period of growth and then maybe occasional decline, but it goes in certain cycles depending what's going on. Um, Generally, the problem for small economies is the peaks and troughs that they experience are significantly higher. Okay, so the peaks can be higher because if the world economy is functioning very well, then they tend to do very well with their kind of exporting.
Hmm.
But when the economy does badly, an economic crisis, COVID, pandemic, the current situation in the Middle East, then those troughs are substantially greater than for, say, economies like the UK, etc. So it's this volatility, but it's the magnitude of the difference between the peaks and the troughs that is the real problem for these economies. And that makes economic policy making very difficult um, because they cannot control anything in the global economy. The only thing they can control is their own policy and their own production, their competitiveness and their exporting and the well-being of their people.
Yeah. Right. Um, Interesting. I've got a couple of, I've got like two sort of almost like points where I kind of want to jump off here. I guess I mean, because what I'm hearing from, at least in this regard, is I guess there's a couple of factors. The reason why small economies do seem to be very affected by what's going on in the world is because they're very dependent on what's going on in the world. If you take America, for example, America is a very large country, large landmass. They produce a lot of oil, food. They have a lot of economies of scale on some things. And so they have a little bit more resilience to things that are going on elsewhere. If rare earths aren't coming in, or if oil isn't being supplied, or the Straits of Hormuz are being sort of shut off. With that being said, even for an economy of that size, they're still very much affected, and that those kind of effects are only magnified for a small economy where you can't produce nearly all the things that you need in your society. Maybe you could when 1,000 years ago is where we were sort of agrarian societies and most of the economy was just agriculture. But in a modern day where you need aluminium, you need goods and services, you need rare earth minerals, you need oil, you need energy, you need all these other things. You become incredibly dependent on global trade, and that and if the global economy is doing worse, that means your economy is going to do much worse. That's kind of one of the angles. I guess the second sort of angle on that is you mentioned, I think, some economies there, like South Korea, that have kind of mm, done relatively well in sort of recent memory. How do you define small economies in this context? Because obviously South Korea has a relatively sort of large economy, for its size and stuff. Some people, but it's certainly not like the size of like the States, China, even the UK to some degree in terms of population size. So how do you define small economies within this context?
Okay, well, that's opening up a can of worms straight away.
All right, so my
I'll deal,
apologies.
I'll deal with I'll deal with your second part first.
Got you.
Okay, um, there's been a lot of debate. Um, there is no single definition. Okay, different studies, different institutions use different measures. Okay, traditionally, the United Nations and the World Bank have used 1 million population. The British Commonwealth has traditionally used 1.5 million. For some of our work, we started off using a benchmark of 3 million, then we raised it to 3.5. And then we thought, kind of, this is, whatever definition you use, if you're going to take a particular number, is purely arbitrary.
Hmm.
And the difference between, say, an economy with 1 million and one person and 1 million people in the UN definition, those are completely different, but in practice, identical. So, what we have tended to do in recent research is we've said, okay, we're not going to use a definition. What we're going to do is we're going to look And we've always analyzed small economies in the context of all the economies in the world. Okay. So we're looking at how small economies have performed relative to those which are larger.
Okay.
Okay. Rather than saying, okay, let's focus on a group of small economies in complete isolation to what's happening in the US or the UK.
Okay.
So this is where we have been consistently at odds with orthodox kind of theoretical and practical policy implications relating to international relations and, in particular, international economics. International economics, this is kind of one of my kind of pet grievances, shall I say. International economics says a small economy is an economy that cannot influence its external economic environment. Okay, that's the general
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
the general assumption. You go to macroeconomics, international trade. That's the definition.
Yeah. I have
You
questions
then
about
look,
that definition, but sure.
you then look at which countries that fits. Okay, United States, China, India, maybe the European Union as a group of countries, and that's it. So everybody else is small. Well, that's bloody useless. Okay. One of the things that has been revealed over time while we've kind of been looking into, I mean, the focus that we've had is the economic performance and determinants of growth in small economies. That sort of kind of blanket assumption that everybody's small doesn't help at all. It does not inform any insights and so on. So what we've generally done over the last 10, 20 years, where we've kind of eschewed this kind of arbitrary threshold, is we've looked at the size distribution of economies. So we take the largest first in terms of population. So we've got India and China at the top end, 40% of the global population. And then we've got everybody else going down. We can then divide all of that into simple quartiles, or if you want, deciles. So what that means is that we can look at what's going on in the fourth quartile, the lowest quartile, size quartile, or possibly the third quartile compared with the second and first quartile.
Hmm.
Just to give you an example, many of the countries that are focused upon by orthodox economics and orthodox international relations are not in the bottom quartile. They're not even in the third quartile. In fact, some of them are not even in the second quartile. They're in the top quartile of size. Okay, so we can pick up quite a few European countries there and various others. Okay. Um, So the inferences and insights that that orthodox approach is giving tells us almost nothing,
Yeah.
because the questions and the answers are much more nuanced. They're much more subtle.
Yeah.
Okay. So some of the work we've done is not only on, and this is another kind of area of kind of discussion, is on non-sovereign territories. So we've looked at um, economies which are sovereign. They are classed as bona fide countries, usually members of the United Nations. But then there are a whole raft of territories, something like 70 inhabited territories around the world, which are non sovereign, have various types of relationships with their metropolitan country, that is, the kind of former colonizer in some cases. The UK's got a lot of these. Um, on average, these are significantly smaller than the smaller sovereign economies. So we can, by enlarging the number of economies we're interested in, but also distinguishing between sovereign and non sovereign, we again see further nuances and subtleties in terms of behavior, specialization, economic performance.
Right. And how does this sort of feed into the research then? Like, how did you go about looking at this kind of topic area, and kind of what were the objectives that you were trying to achieve, sort of at least from the outset?
I think I've got to go all the way back to where this kind of interest started. A very well known, very well respected development economist, no longer with us. died more than 30 years ago, Hans Singer, did a lot of very important work in economic development during his lifetime. And I was at a conference with him a long time ago, obviously. I was a younger academic then. I'm rather an older academic now. And he made a remark that, for once, I disagreed with him in passing. This was a passing remark, nothing serious debate or something. And he said that we shouldn't really be interested in the economic performance and determinants of economic growth. I'm paraphrasing here because it was a long time ago, of Hong Kong and Singapore because they were special examples of city states and therefore standard growth theory was irrelevant and they were not interesting.
Mm,
And I thought, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, you know, if we have standard theories, economic growth, development, industrialization, regardless of what we're trying to do, we need to test that theory, true meaning of prove, um, with all possible examples.
sure. Yeah.
Um, and then a couple of years later, or 2 or 3 years later, um, I had a discussion with a former colleague of mine who I've become my principal co-author in this area. And he was coming from the point of view of regional economics and some of the issues faced by peripheral and island states within the European Union.
Okay.
My background, primarily development economics. So I've always long been interested in the Pacific, um, Africa, and the Caribbean. And so we put our kind of expertise together and we said, okay, well, actually, we've got lots and lots of examples of smaller economies. And when we actually look at them a little bit more closely, it's not only Hong Kong and Singapore. I mean, Hong Kong is actually very, very large. It's up into the third quartile in terms of size, whereas Singapore is still just in the fourth quartile. Um, all these economies seem to be doing quite well, or nearly all of them seem to be doing quite well. But when you look at the literature available, that is kind of geography, this is a long time ago, 30 years, more than 30 years ago, geography, economics, international relations, etc. All of this literature was highly pessimistic and saying, you know, if you're small, tough. You
Right.
know, you've got so many structural kind of handicaps that you're not going to be successful.
Mm,
Okay. You need you need special assistance, you need foreign aid, you need concessions, all sorts of things at the international level. Well, we then started doing um, a kind of table, which we've done on and off over 30 years, which looks at the number of economies within each of the World Bank income categories. So the World Bank divides countries up into unequal groups: high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, low income. So the low income ones are the least developed countries, the low and lower middle income are the developing countries. And we said, okay, well, let's get all of these economies and see which income category they're in. And the astonishing thing is that vast majority of small economies are in the World Bank high income category.
interesting.
There are some in the upper middle income category and one or two in the lower middle income category, but zero in the low income category. And that pattern has remained the same for 30 years. So even when I did a lot of my most recent version of this, which was based, I think, on 2023 or 2024 data, the pattern was still consistent. So what we've got in terms of a kind of intellectual challenge, as well as, a practical challenge for people who live there, is these economies appear to be severely constrained physically, um, geographically, economically. And yet somehow they're performing way beyond expectations, way beyond the pessimism of a lot of the literature.
Right.
And that stimulated us to investigate if they're facing so many critical challenges which seem, you know, you can't change where you're located in the world.
You
You
cannot.
can't change your remoteness. You can't change the global economy to benefit you if you're so small and insignificant.
Yeah, I guess it beg. I get well, and I guess this kind of leads into why you sort of started looking into a lot of these areas. But it kind of begs the question: if a lot of these small economies are, incredibly high income for a lot of this, in that regard, despite not having the traditional things that we would expect for high performing, high growth economies, resource base and access to people, influence on the global economy, all this kind of stuff. Why is it that so many of them are doing so well?
Well, it's not only that they're doing so well in terms of incomes in the World Bank categories, but um, both ourselves and one or two other researchers investigated how small economies performed under the Human Development Index.
Right? Yeah.
That is, measures of health, um, education, income, and social support. The pattern is almost exactly the same. They have much better education and health performance than most larger countries, and social provision is much better. So the pattern is repeated under the HDI. So one of the things I did a while back, not that long ago, just before the COVID pandemic, there was some data on happiness, international comparisons of happiness. There's a lot of problems with that, but I did the same kind of exercise for small economies with happiness. And do you know what? It was the same pattern. So what we've got is we've got these kind of ec- societies, the economic inference and geographical inference and international relations inference suggests should be struggling. And yet they've got high incomes, they're happy, they've got good social provision, score high on health, score high on education. So, our big question was, how are they managing it?
It would be, yeah.
And it's a fascinating question, but nobody had really asked that question before. Nobody had really noticed that there was a consistent pattern across the globe that very small economies, and we're talking in particular the bottom quartile, not the third quartile, but the bottom quartile, the smallest economies, were actually doing very, very well. So what was the explanation? Well, the fundamental explanation, and that's why your kind of mention of crises is important, is the period really from the early 1980s through to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. That's almost a 30-year period where globalization, trade liberalization, global security were all positive
Mm. Yep.
and provided the f the fertile environment for small economies to prosper because it promoted trade, um, and the expansion of trade. Transport costs came down, so even the most remotest economies were not suffering. And then since really the mid to late 90s, we suddenly have the advent of digital trade and the internet. And that means that all sorts of commerce and economic activity can be coordinated regardless of where you're located.
Yeah. Right.
So the big challenge for small economies has really been the impacts of the global financial crisis and then COVID and now geopolitics, as well as climate change. Okay. So
Interesting.
we've
Yeah.
got a set of crises coming from different directions, all of which have important adverse implications for small economies.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting because, yeah, to your point, particularly from, as you said, the 80s, there been this, well, first of all, stability relatively to other periods in history within the global economy. There's been traditionally a little bit less wars and less conflicts and stuff. That's probably might be changing a bit now, obviously, but there was obviously a period of like security globally. That probably allowed for a little bit more globalization and international trade because you can create relationships across the world, but also developments in technology allow what were very remote players away from the big markets of India, China, America, Europe, where people consume a lot more goods. Um, Digitalization of technology and just expansion of other forms of transportation as well. I imagine sort of airlines and things like that has allowed them to maybe access some of these other markets, and because they're obviously much smaller in size, they've only got to serve, I guess, a very small portion of these sort of large extended markets for them to actually become quite successful, I would imagine. So yeah, it's quite an interesting, and obviously we did also have this period as well, 80s onwards of decreasing tariffs, international trade, and all this kind of stuff that came along with this kind of peace dividend stuff as well. So yeah, so it's interesting that when you put it like that, it kind of makes a lot of sense that a lot of these smaller economies can do quite well. I guess that the other side of that is as well to your point you're making about the crises and other things, is that when these things do happen, they're probably disproportionately affected as well. It's kind of like a double-edged sword in that regard.
Well, I can come back on that because one of the things that we investigated was not only why had they been successful and finding they had been successful, but asking the question, why have they been successful? Okay, so the expansion of trade has been in, basically what we call, export-led growth. So we talked briefly about Korea and Taiwan. They succeeded through export-led growth. China has succeeded through export-led growth. Export-led growth has been key to small economies, and of course, the amount of growth and the amount of exports needed to actually create the growth is significantly less than, say, China. But the further question then is, okay, well, how have they done it? What have they done that has enabled them to tap into the global market in effectively? And there are three principal sources um, of growth. The two most important ones are, in the broadest sense, financial services, which for the last 20, 30 years has been conducted um, digitally. And that spreads from including kind of standard banking, insurance, reinsurance, um, all the way up to tax havens and money laundering.
Sure.
Okay, but a lot of small economies are not tax havens. Okay, but some are. Okay, so that's one area: financial services. What you need for a good financial services sector? The first thing you need is good people. You need clever people, and one of the things that small economies have invested heavily in is education, and they've created a core of very capable people who are specialists in financial services. So, so that's one dimension. The second area where they've specialized in is tourism, international tourism. Okay, a lot of the small economies are, if you start looking at the sources of their economic activity, we're talking between 50 and 90% of GDP is dependent on the tourism sector. There's a big caveat to that, which I will come back to. But this tourism is medium and long haul tourism in general, primarily because a lot of these places, something like 80% of small economies, those in the bottom quartile or even those in the third quartile, are island. So not just small, but also islands. Islands are a dominant subset of small economies, but for various reasons, small economies analysis of small economies explains nearly all we need to understand about island small economies.
Right.
Um, so tourism, international tourism, long haul and medium haul flights. You have a look at the pattern of international tourism for small economies. Um, it's kind of quite surprising that the principal routes, apart from the Caribbean, the principal routes are from the former metropolitan countries to these places, regardless of where they're located in the world. So if you have a look at where the vast majority of tourists in, say, Tahiti come from, in other words, French Polynesia, they come from mainland France.
Mm. Right.
Okay. And the same is true all the way around the world. Okay.
Got you.
British tourists tend to go to a lot of, on medium and long haul tourism, go to former British colonies that are now small economies. That's tourism. That's financial services. We've talked about the financial crisis. So you can understand straight away, without me going into any further detail, that's going to clobber these economies.
Right.
We talked about COVID. Well, COVID had a lockdown. China only relieved its lockdown relatively recently. Lockdown, no tourism, particularly long haul and medium haul. Okay. We're talking about climate change. Okay. And the challenges of climate change. Well, a lot of these places are islands, sea level rises. Out in the Pacific, we've already got major problems with sea level rises. One of the things that this does is it destroys freshwater lenses. That is, a lot of tropical atolls in the Pacific have deposits of fresh water which are surrounded by land, and then you have the Pacific.
Mm.
And sea level rises is destroying these freshwater lenses. Um, I don't know whether you remember, the former prime minister of the Maldives gave a press conference up to his thighs on in one part of the Maldives, which previously had been dry land. And this was a plea about sea level rises and the climate consequences. And then we've got the geopolitics. And the geopolitics kind of feeds in subtle ways. It's now a challenge. But we can ask a rhetorical question. How, in geopolitical terms, how does a small economy defend itself? The answer is it can't. You know, there is nothing a relatively small economy, however wealthy, can do to defend itself.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. That's become apparent with respect to places like Bahrain and Oman and other places in the Gulf at the moment.
Mm.
So, do you spend a lot of money on defense if you cannot effectively defend yourself anyway?
Right. Yeah.
The answer is it's a waste of money. So, what has happened over the last 40 years in particular is, because we've had a kind of, or up until very recently, we've had a global peace dividend. The rule of law under the United Nations, plus the great powers, okay, the hegemons, if we kind of use the international relations literature, regardless of who they are, they have provided a global defense umbrella.
Hmm.
If I can take you back to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, for example. On the other hand, if these countries choose to do something, then there's not much anybody can do to stop them. Okay, Afghanistan being successive example with the Soviet Union, and then the United States and the Western Europe.
Very specific examples, though. I mean, Afghanistan, given the terrain and like the
Yes, yes.
ability and all this kind of stuff. So
But
it's
the point is that the hegemons will behave as they wish to, regardless.
right.
And up until January 2025, the rule of international law and following international law was generally accepted, even by the largest, most powerful economies.
Sure.
That's kind of in question now. So, what small economies have done is said, right, what is the point of spending money on defense?
Hmm. Yeah.
We can use that money for something else.
Right. Yeah.
And they have switched that money into social support, education. And, we're at a critical juncture at the moment in the UK. Okay, we have to increase, or we're kind of planning to increase defense expenditure. Where's the money going to come from? What are we going to have to cut in order to do that?
Right. Yeah.
Well, until now, the small economies have been in the kind of very kind of happy position of saying, right, well, we don't need to worry about geopolitics because everybody respects us, even though we're small.
Yeah. It's an interesting one. in a way, it's almost like this weird blessing from not being able to defend yourself in the sense that there's actually no point trying. And so,
Yes,
yeah, so by not trying, you can actually just spend a lot of money on improving the productivity of your workforce, i.e., like through
yes.
education and stuff. And so, yeah, by you can just like yeah, have maybe a little bit better economic outcomes and growth and stuff. And then,
This is it's another dimension of realpolitik.
yeah,
It we wrote a paper many, many years ago called "The Importance of Being Unimportant,"
it's a good title. That's good.
and that exemplified all the things that small economies were able to do. They were able to kind of get round or fudge some international agreements. Um, they didn't have to spend money on defense, and they could do other things
I
because nobody cared. Nobody really worried about them.
on that point, I mean, I'm sorry if this is kind of like taking us off topic a little bit, but one thing that I've noticed, just in having studied economics a little bit myself, and just like observing some of the geopolitics stuff, is that frequently, although not all the time, there are countries across the world that are relatively poor in terms of human development and all this kind of stuff, despite being incredibly resource rich. Like Venezuela, for example, potentially has some of the highest oil reserves in the world, very poor country, and there's a load of other examples as well. And you mentioned at the start of this that a lot of these small economies, despite not having resources, despite not having large population sizes, all these kind of things, have been able to develop in a in a pretty great way, and in a variety of ways, happiness, human development, and incomes. By the sounds of what you're saying, I'm I'm almost wondering when you mention this sort of concept of like the importance of being unimportant. I wonder if by having natural resources and these other strategically maybe important geopolitical aspects to you, um, that although on the surface it might seem, oh, that's a good thing, we've got resources we can exploit to try and help us grow and develop and do all this kind of stuff, that actually, in reality, how that works is because you have those things, the great powers who have a lot of power, influence, military, end up taking a very keen interest in you and then potentially end up fighting and squabbling over and doing various politicking that can end up making your country a lot worse. And so, weirdly, if you're small enough and unimportant enough to the geopolitical strategy of the world, you can almost find yourself in a weird position. And actually, I don't have to pay for much defense spending. We're kind of remote enough, or like we're unimportant enough that people don't really, it's not worth their time and effort to control anyway. And then you have this weird situation where you can actually pour a lot of money into sort of human development and then end up being quite prosperous as a result, strangely.
Um, you're not. I don't think you're far from the truth there. Okay. What I will point out, we've got to kind of distinguish between internal and external pressures.
Sure.
Um, One of the other things that small economies score very highly on is governance.
Okay.
That is the quality of policies. Okay. The World Bank has produced for the last 20 odd years world governance indicators. There are six indicators. Um, and again, if we do the same tabular exercise with the kind of the size quartiles, surprise, surprise, small economies score incredibly highly on governance as well.
Hmm.
And there is a very, very important reason why they score highly on governance. I've had arguments and disputes with some people arguing that small societies tend to be more corrupt and more based on clientelism. That is, who you know, and because everybody knows each other. Okay. But the other thing is because, as I've already kind of, stated, small economies are highly dependent on being successful as part of the global economy. If any government within a small economy or politician makes a mistake in terms of, oh, let's do this stupid policy, it becomes apparent incredibly quickly.
Hmm.
You can't get away with being incompetent
No.
because policy mistakes feed back straight into the health of the economy immediately.
Yeah, that I can get.
Okay. I mean, just to give you, I mean, you talked about, the first point which we didn't get back to is now an appropriate time to bring it in. You talked about the United States and its kind of integration with the global economy. The US, in terms of trade and its importance to the US economy, is less than 20%. Okay. The US economy just can chug along on its own. Okay. You mentioned rare earths, and there's various other things that it can't produce itself, but just about everything else it can.
Right.
So it's, what happens in the global economy? Okay. Well, it's 20% of our economy, but, not too important. Um, the most recent figures I saw for Singapore, and Singapore's quite big, um, was this ratio was about 325%. For small economies, it's always well over 100%, sometimes two, three, 400, just because everything has to be imported and you have to export in order to pay for that.
Sure.
So this high level of dependence. So even though a small downturn in the global economy feeds through into this. So internally, small economies have to get the policies right. If they make any mistakes whatsoever, bang, they find out very quickly. So not only do they have to be flexible, they've got to rectify those mistakes very, very quickly. Any policy mistakes have to be corrected almost immediately
Right.
because the consequences for the economy as a whole and the society as a whole is so great.
Yeah, yeah.
In a country like the United Kingdom or the United States and most larger countries, any, and when I say large, I'm talking in the top top half of the size distribution. Okay, countries have got away, and politicians and governments have got away with making incredibly terrible mistakes. You've talked about natural resources. I'm sure you're aware of the resource curse thesis.
Yep, sure.
Strangely, those countries with abundant natural resources appear to do worse. Okay, well, yeah, the resource curse thesis is kind of the opposite. You know, those countries without resources do very well in general. Okay, and there's all sorts of arguments. I don't know the answers, but there's all sorts of arguments about governance and economic policy and so on. Small economies have to have good governance, and they score very highly on that. Okay. So they have what we would call, with a small c, conservative economic policies, fiscal, monetary policy. They're very careful about what they do, but that yet they have to be very flexible, or if I can use management speak, they have to be very agile.
Hmm.
They have to spot opportunities and take those opportunities because it's a matter of kind of survival. The UK can make all sorts of mistakes, and yeah, economists and finance people and journalists will all complain, oh, well, that seems pretty stupid. But the average person in the street is not necessarily affected by it,
Yep.
except in the longer term.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, um, the interesting thing, and you kind of put your finger on it implicitly, and it's something that's been revealed over the years by our research, is we can ask an alternative rhetorical question. And it's not, why have small economies done so well? It's the opposite. Why have large economies in general done so badly?
Yeah. That's it. Mm.
Because it's two sides of the same coin.
Sure.
Okay. And when you start looking at larger economies, they, developing most large developing economies are in the lower, well, by definition, are in the lower um, World Bank income categories. And all these problems of resources and industrialization, stroke development, human development indices, happiness, um, etc. Governance, they're way down. Um, so one of the kind of this is something that, I'm intrigued by and still investigating and mulling over is what is it about large societies that leads to kind of category errors, groupthink, which doesn't occur in small societies. Okay. We talk about levels of governance. The European Union word for this is subsidiarity. Local governance and allowing local people to make decisions appears to be much more effective than allowing central government, however high up and however big, to make decisions.
Sure. I guess well, again, I guess I'm ignorant to a lot of these factors. My imagination would take me to the fact that, I mean, kind of to your point earlier in regards to the small economies, because they're smaller and in smaller scale, a lot of the effects of policy decision making are felt a lot sooner compared to larger scale, more complex economies and stuff. And typically, I would say, as humans, we're not particularly fantastic in the aggregate of looking to, investing for the future and looking sort of 20, 30, 40 years down of a policy decision today. We tend to fall short and become a little bit short termist in that regard. Um, but perhaps if a policy decision that the government comes out with in the UK or wherever, some of these larger economies, was felt immediately, I think back to sort of the COVID 19 pandemic and, the incredible amount of quantitative easing that was conducted. Obviously, that was done for a reason, but inevitably, if you do that, money is going to become less valuable just innately, and you're going to get maybe perhaps increased levels of inflation later down the road. Um, that's something that you're solving for now. But if unless you do other factors to compensate for it, aren't necessarily mitigating for future events potentially. And I'm just wondering, in this context, is perhaps the reason just simply that with smaller economies and smaller sizes of countries in this regard, they're just a little bit more um, sensitive to impacts in the short run that allow them to really sort of bring them together to make decisions in a much more decisive fashion in terms of the root causes. And also, they probably just have a little bit more, because of the scale, a little bit more idea about actually how best money and resources are spent in order to get the biggest impact. Whereas it's probably a lot more difficult to do that over a population of 60 to 100 million than it is against a population of 50,000, right? Because they're people just like it's much easier to see the effects on the specific people around you, I would imagine.
I think the importance is that any policy errors in small economies are highly visible.
Hmm.
They're felt, but they're visible. Um, and there tends to be less, shall I say, ideological division about how policies should be formulated. And this comes down to governance. There tends to be a consensus around what is good for the country, but disagreement about how it should be achieved,
Okay,
rather than fundamental ideological divides.
I see. Interesting.
Um, I mean, there are papers that say small economies are, as I talked about clientelism. They're characterized by greater clientelism, and that leads to kind of all sorts of kind of problems and corruption and so on. Yet, at the aggregate level, it doesn't appear to be kind of feeding through. Okay,
Hmm.
I mean, you cited COVID, and that's a good example of the immediate effects of government behaviour even in an economy the size of the UK, in terms of lockdown, furlough, payment, quantitative easing, trying to keep the bare bones of the economy functioning in spite of the pandemic.
Hmm.
And that was very visible. But a lot of other things, whatever the government does, how long does it take to increase defense expenditure and when do we kind of see the effects? Well, we're talking 2, 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yep.
Um, and
Energy, same
what
thing. Like
Yeah, yeah. A lot of things take time. A lot of things take time, and um, the discount rate of citizens tends to be much shorter. That is, we want change now or tomorrow, Don't tell us it's going to happen, 5 years' time,
Right. Yeah.
because we'll have forgotten. I mean, coming back to economic policy a little bit, if I can kind of
Sure.
move us back to the economic policy, um, one of the other features of most successful small economies, and in particular those that have prospered via all the different forms of financial services, is that fundamentally, if you're very, very small, and this is where I did mention the orthodox kind of economic view of small, if you're extremely small, your scope for monetary and fiscal maneuvering is highly limited.
Sure.
Okay. Um, so fiscal policy, how do you finance fiscal policy? Normal ways, debt, but there are limits very quickly. A lot of the Caribbean economies at the moment are severely indebted, partly because they're having to pay for COVID,
Hmm.
the consequences of COVID. The other dimension of this is because they specialize in financial services, they have to have credible currencies. And intriguingly, most, not all, but nearly all small economies, and including territories. You may be surprised to know that some UK territories use the US dollar, not the sterling, but most small economies either have very long term fixed exchange rates against the major currencies,
Yep.
usually the US dollar or sterling, or they don't have their own currency at all.
Right.
And what that does is it provides credibility for the financial services industry. Because one of the big risks, if you're an investor or hiding your money for the money laundering people, is that you want a guarantee of low risk and you eliminate currency exposure.
Sure.
Um, However, the monetary policy implications of that choice, and that's a long term choice that's, was evident from almost from independence of a lot of these economies, is you can't have an independent monetary policy
Hmm.
because you can't affect the money supply.
Right. And then yeah, it's better to just find a reliable currency that you can peg it to, and then take away
Well,
all the administration of like having to
the
have
major
your.
yeah, the major hard currencies.
Hmm.
Um, you can't have an independent monetary policy. It means the inflation rate is effectively the inflation rate of the parent the parent economy of your currency.
Sure.
Okay, but since that's primarily the dollar and sterling, and in some cases the euro or the Australian dollar or the New Zealand dollar, what that means is these kind of larger economies are generally macroeconomically stable and credible.
Hmm.
And that has allowed the financial services sector to prosper significantly, not because they're money laundering, but because it's credible. It's very low risk in terms of currency risk. Okay. So, this again is a strategy that they've adopted that favors them. One of the things we talked about in that paper I mentioned earlier about the importance of being insignificant is that small economies are able to free ride in a number of respects. We've effectively talked about free riding with respect to global defense and geopolitics, but also with respect to currencies.
Yep.
Okay. Um, and the vast majority of these economies either have fixed exchange rates. So if you have a look at the Eastern Caribbean dollar, that's fixed link with the US dollar, or they're using the US dollar. Um, there are one or two intriguing examples, and I'll give you an anecdote. Uh, a few years ago, we did some work for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK, which was looking at the economy of the Ascension Island. Okay. This population, the resident population on Ascension Island, not including kind of military personnel, is probably less than 1,500. Sterling circulates, St. Helena currency circulates, okay, because Ascension Island is linked with St. Helena in spite of the distance because it's administered, they're administered jointly. The US dollar circulates. Okay. So in a small economy of, effectively 1,500 people, you've got three different currencies circulating.
Mm.
But there is, but the St. Helena pound is linked one for one with sterling. So, you get this is not an anomaly, it's just an intriguing anecdote.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess they've all, yeah, it's interesting. If you could be going about your daily life and you're having to use like three different currencies just to sort of participate.
It depends where you're shopping and where you're permitted to shop.
Mm.
What 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 currencies you used. I'll give you another example. I'm doing some work with the University of Aruba,
Mm.
and Aruba is in the Caribbean. It's kind of in categorized nowadays as in association with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And again, different currencies are circulating. The first assumption would be it's the territory of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is in the European Union, so euro. No, okay. It's the US dollar primarily. Um, but also, sterling could be used under certain circumstances, and they also have their own Aruban florin, which is linked at a fixed rate with the euro. But because they are something like 75% of their tourists are from the United States, everything is really in dollars.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Because I suppose ultimately, money is ultimately just a means of exchange, right? And so it requires belief in it, just in the belief in the system to be able to exchange goods and services. And I suppose you could have your own currency if, like, in a country, but ultimately, if the people of that country believe in something else in terms of a means of exchange more than something else, they'll just use that. And so that's probably if most
Well,
of their tourists are coming
what
from America. I mean,
one, it's about credibility.
hmm
Always, trust in fiat currency it has to be based on trust. Okay, so it's about credibility. Okay, and as long as the credibility, people don't mind. But let us take an example. If a small economy or any economy with its own currency, a government in collaboration with the central bank could, independent monetary policy. You only have to look at Turkey and the interference between the government and the central bank has been highly inflationary.
hmm
Now, that's because the Turkish lira is an independent currency. And um, they've made a whole series of policy errors. I think it's three central bank governors have been sacked in the last 5 years because they haven't done what the government wants. Similarly, the US chair of the Federal Reserve is under pressure from the current president because the government or the White House wants lower interest rates, and the Federal Reserve says, hold on a minute, we've got kind of rising price pressures. And that was before the situation in Iran. So having an independent currency requires credible policies. Otherwise, the markets vote against you.
Right. Yeah.
So free riding on a hard currency solves that credibility problem until the hard currency itself loses credibility.
No, so you have to pick one that you're pretty sure isn't isn't going to lose credibility anytime soon.
Yes, yes, yes.
Sure. And I suppose you can even like for central banks cost money to administer all the stuff that people and all this kind of stuff. So I suppose it even saves you money to some degree, as
Well,
an
yeah. Aruba has a central bank, and they're monitoring the foreign exchange reserves and export performances, imports, debt, inflation, etc. Trying to, because there is a domestic economy going on, which is separate from the tourism economy, um, and doing a lot of economic policy, but it's very, very small.
Got you. And so, I mean, we've talked about a lot here about somehow, these small economies have done surprisingly well, obviously, but they're sort of disproportionately effective in some of these sort of crisis points. Are there any examples of where small economies have actually done quite well, or I guess better, in some of these crises periods that kind of buck the trend almost that you've sort of found in the research?
They have done, but they're few and far between. One of the papers that's just been published um, has a look at. We published a few years ago a paper that analysed the impact of the global economic crisis on small economies. And what we found was something that we've already talked about, was that the negative impacts of the global financial crisis was heavily amplified for most small economies. Okay. The general finding for this recent paper on the impacts of the COVID pandemic basically kind of sees the same sort of thing happening, that the adverse effects significantly amplified. However, one of the things we tried to do in this more recent paper, which has only just been come out, um, is say, okay, let's see what happened between the onset of the financial crisis and the year in which we kind of think that the pandemic is almost over. So we're into the recovery period. So that's looking at comparing 2008 with 2022. Okay, well, how have these small economies performed between those two dates?
Sure.
And what we find is that the vast majority now in 2022 had higher economic performance, greater economic performance, higher GDP compared with the moment of the onset of the financial crisis.
Okay.
Okay, so in other words, in spite of kind of 10, 12 years of really stormy weather for these economies, most of them have gone through the two very fundamental crises for small economies and come out the other side um, still performing reasonably well. One or two economies have performed amazingly well, but those tend to be um, dependent primarily on the performance of natural resources. So long as economic growth continued, they were okay. And one of the things that we saw in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis was the Chinese economy carried on growing really until the late 2000 teens.
Hmm.
And that pulled a lot of resource prices and demand for resources upwards. So and we're not talking about oil, but some of the oil economies did well, of course, but we're talking about a whole range of mineral resources. So some good examples, Sao Tome e Principe out in West Africa, um, a number of others. On the other hand, at the other extreme, a number of economies have, as of 2022, had lower economic activity, lower GDP in real terms than they did at the onset of the financial crisis. In other words, they were still suffering after 14 years and still had not recovered even back to where they were in 2008.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, if I'm allowed to refer to my notes, I will kind of just talk you through which ones these were.
Sure.
Okay, so the principal ones who had not recovered by 2022. So GDP was actually in aggregate lower than it was in 2008. Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, the federal states of Micronesia, Palau, Aruba, which I mentioned, Puerto Rico, part of the United States, but in association, and Equatorial Guinea. The other economy that includes is Macau.
Hmm.
And the Macau example is primarily because the Chinese lockdown for the pandemic lasted much longer than it did in most Western European economies and elsewhere in the globe.
Hmm.
So Macau's principal claim to fame these days, um, apart from being a sinful place. I think that's quoting the lady from Shanghai and Orson Welles way back in the late 1940s, is Macau is founded upon gambling these days. And the lockdown prevented the gamblers going to Macau.
Mm.
So Macau, as of 2022, its GDP in aggregate was 75% of that of 2008. Okay.
Yeah. Well.
So, really big hit, but we can explain some of that due to the Chinese lockdown, etc.
Yeah. No, certainly. And I guess like how does this affect small economies? Obviously, from this research, is there anything that small economies can derive from this about how they can set up their economies to mitigate some of these effects moving forward? Or are they simply just at the whim to a lot of these forces without being able to do much to be able to combat them?
I think that's a really, really critical question. And there's been a lot of reflection, policy reflection, since the global financial crisis, and in particular, the COVID pandemic. Because one of the things the COVID pandemic revealed, way out in the Pacific, but also in the Caribbean, was the inadequacy of the health infrastructure to cope with such a pandemic.
Okay. Yeah.
And, and debts, debt, they couldn't afford a lot of furlough, debts rose. One of the things we haven't talked about that it feeds into this is tourism is a major source of employment in just about all of these economies. And it's low income. It's low income. Okay. Financial services and natural resources give the income, the value added. Tourism is a source of employment, but it's kind of relatively low skilled in general. Okay. And these economies couldn't found it very difficult to fund furlough without raising debt for all the people in the tourism sector. And most of these tourism people were unemployed for 12, 24 months.
Mm.
Okay. So major problems. So what are the challenges for small economies? Okay. Well, the standard solution that we see in kind of economic policy circles, particularly for economic development and growth, is, well, you're highly concentrated in tourism and financial services and a little bit in natural resources. You should diversify. Okay. It fits in with the resource curse solutions as well. The big challenge is, okay, good point. That's the standard or orthodox kind of solution. How are we going to do that? What else is there?
Right.
Okay. And the answer is, well, if there were things, they would probably have found them by
I'll
now.
be doing them. Yeah.
So real problem. Diversification is not necessarily a solution. There is an argument that we've been putting forward, which we haven't kind of fully realized yet, is that the dominance of financial services and tourism in particular may have distorted the economies such that even though there are areas where they could have moved into, um, they have done so well through these successful sectors that these other alternatives have been crowded out.
Bit of a Dutch disease
That's a
situation.
classic Dutch disease argument, yes, that tourism and financial services have created a form of Dutch disease. Okay. But what have they got? Well, there are all sorts of digital services. Even 20, 25 years ago, I knew of design um, consultancies located in places like the Falkland Islands and elsewhere, Pacific, who were submitting designs and doing consultancy digital for major markets.
Mm.
Okay, so that's an area. Um, Offshore energy generation,
Mm.
solar, but also wind power. Um, there's an argument that the blue economy provides potential solutions. So more fisheries. Oh dear. Well, that's a not. It's a renewable resource, but we've got major problems with fisheries. Um, Okay, well, what else have we got in the oh, we can always destroy the seabed and have, deep sea mining.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've got an environmental challenge. And one of the interesting things is if we have a look at the waters around most small economies, particularly in particular the small islands, they actually possess a significant proportion of the globe's economic exploitation zones. And those overlap with important biospheres. Okay. Um, one of the things I'm going to go off at a slight tangent here, and you might want to come back later on. Um, take the British Indian Ocean Island territory, i.e., Chagos.
Mhm.
That whole territory is an environmental reserve. Okay. So there are concerns that any change in status will lead to the erosion, environmental erosion, and adverse by ad, ad, adverse effects on the biosphere.
Sure. Which could
Mm.
actually impact like tourism potentially, which is something that they are actually getting some monies and stuff for generally.
Well, we'll then come back to okay, well, what about the existing specializations? Well, natural resources, okay, fisheries, there are kind of issues with conservation of stock. What about financial services? Well, the European Union, the OECD, have for 2 decades been trying to clamp down on tax havens and money laundering and tax evasion. So many of these small economies are under pressure um, for increasing transparency. Um, there are a number which are on the blacklist. Okay. So some financial services are under threat because they don't have sufficient quality financial governance. Tourism. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the tourism, primarily because it's islands, medium and long haul. And when we look at the patterns, we see that a lot of these more remote islands are dependent on long haul tourism from places like Western Europe, let alone closer markets. We have the problem of carbon emissions. Okay. And there is a lot of talk at the moment about um, carbon taxes on kerosene. Um, there's all sorts of articles on ecotourism. Okay, changing tourism from mass tourism to kind of more environmentally friendly, socially kind of supportive ecotourism. The big problem is that is kind of a drop in the ocean, to mix my metaphors, compared with the carbon emissions of getting the tourists to that place and back again.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. The, the significant rise in recent oil prices is going to hit long haul and medium haul prices, and that's going to lead to a downturn in tourism. Whether we should be having long haul and medium haul tourism is another environmental issue. Okay. Should we have appropriate carbon taxes? If we have appropriate carbon taxes, one, we're cutting off these remote small economies. The second thing is we're saying this sort of tourism is only for the relatively wealthy.
Mm.
So there are all sorts of big implications there. Okay. So we've got diversification, we've got that. We've got the global economy with just climate change. They are challenged by climate change. Okay. Sea level rises, etc. They've done quite a lot at the United Nations and in various other international fora. But at the end of the day, the implementation of the Paris agreements and even the Kyoto and Rio and all the other kind of policy kind of agreements and um, such like, it's taking too long,
Right.
taking far too long. So we don't know. And then we've got the geopolitics. And that geopolitics is threatening to put the realpolitik of reduced defense expenditure into reverse. What can these economies do about that? Well, the only thing they can do is basically um, get closer to their powerful neighbors, or, you know, be much more closely, cooperating with their former metropolitan countries.
Right. It's interesting about the climate point you made there, actually. It's because, again, so many of these small countries happen to be island nations. Rising sea levels actually does also impact them quite significantly in terms of their ability to act in their economies, and also maybe the costs and stuff that they have to maybe incur to try and prevent, and mitigate the aspects of climate change and stuff as well. So, although on the one hand, potentially things like carbon taxes and helping the environment would help them in that regard, but if it mitigates anyone ever going there and then their ability to grow as an economy, then it kind of obviously defeats the purpose of that as well. So you've kind of almost got pulling from both directions in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, the contribution of these small economies to um, anthropomorphic climate change is negligible.
Sure.
Okay. The amount of carbon emissions in aggregate for these medium and long haul tourism flights, again, is in the global terms negligible. But they are going to bear the consequences. As I mentioned earlier, the Maldives has already been severely started to be severely affected by sea level rises. Tuvalu and a lot of other low-lying islands. We will in the Pacific. We will lose some of those islands within the next 10 to 20 years.
Mm.
They will disappear underwater. Okay. So there are massive domestic costs just to deal with the consequences. They can't mitigate in general, they can't do anything about climate change per se. They just have to deal with the consequences of moving the population, economic activity, and culture to higher ground
Yeah. Fair.
if it exists.
Hmm. Yeah, it's going to be, yeah, so because to your point, it's these larger economies that are the significant contributors that actually mitigate these things. And if they start putting things in like carbon taxes in place, yeah, it might help the overall aggregate, but then, ultimately these small economies are the ones that are going to feel it anyway. So they kind of, whether the larger economies do something or don't do something, these smaller economies are still going to be affected it like in one form or another by the sounds of it. In regards to looking towards the future, and obviously you've spent obviously an incredible amount of time sort of researching these areas and in terms of small economies across the globe and the relative wealth and various factors. What's a piece of research you would like to see conducted in the future um, that could sort of best build upon the findings that you've come to over your research experience? But then also, or potentially even, what would just be a useful piece of research where you think there is a little bit of a knowledge gap within this area?
I think if I can be kind of a little bit kind of um, more general, I would say it's about the generalizability of some of the findings in relation to larger developing economies.
Hmm.
In other words, in a way, we've kind of almost exhausted we've spent kind of more than 30 years almost systematically going through a range of economic issues facing small economies. We've established the broader challenges. We've established the determinants of growth, the consequences, and policy issues. There are lessons there that can be, I can use a management speak, scaled up.
Hmm.
We've talked about Dutch disease. We've talked about the problems of larger developing economies struggling to deliver prosperity, health, and education to their population. What do small economies tell us that might actually benefit them? Um, and I think it's the takeaway is that effective social interaction and successful societies tell us something about the ones that are not successful, and that the way in which small economies have functioned is something that larger economies might learn something if they could get off their high horses and actually kind of open their ears and eyes to what's going on. Um, in a way, it's a kind of an impossible ask now. It was kind of optimistic 2 years ago. You know, if we kind of move, not breaking down economies or countries into smaller entities, but recognizing that some, the relationship between decision making power and is actually very important. One of the things I always ask people from different countries that I meet is how it's a rhetorical one, but it's how often do you meet your parliamentary representative?
Hmm.
Have you ever met your parliamentary representative?
I have not.
Okay, well, that's a typical UK answer for a start.
Yeah.
Okay, the answer in the UK is almost zero. Okay, if you talk to people in small economies, yes, and that's frequently, and that is about the distance between decision makers and the people affected by the decisions.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, I can't say I'm an original person on this. There was a, a key work published many, many years ago called The Breakdown of Nations. Okay. And it posed a lot of interesting questions, some of which I've picked up on in our work on small economies. And what it really kind of argues about is that people in better control of their destinies make better decisions.
Hmm.
That's the fundamental takeaway. Now, unfortunately, um, the author died about just under 30 years ago. But if I tell you he was the supervisor of Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, you can understand the kind of genesis and the family tree of ideas.
So,
Okay. This book is freely available, and it's quite amusing in some ways. Okay.
hmm.
Uh, and there is one beautiful chapter which is titled something along the lines of what do it's either economists or what do governments know about small economies? And the rest of the chapter is blank. Which, for those of a literary mind bent, will know that that's kind of a version of Lawrence Stern's kind of attitude in Tristan
Yeah.
Shandy. Okay,
Yeah, I think it's a method that's been used a couple of times, I think. No, it sounds like an interesting read. I'll perhaps, like, link it down in the description in case people want to, take a look at it.
freely downloadable on the internet. The only problem is that nobody did any proofreading when it was published. So my version, I kind of did global kind of commands to correct the proofreading.
Got you. Fair enough.
But it's
Um,
a wonderful, stimulating book, even if you don't necessarily agree with it all.
oh, no, fair. Well, I'll have to check it out. Robert, this has been really, really interesting and really great. I think we've really managed to get into a couple of different areas there, and I think I've really expanded my sort of horizons on how I sort of think about some of this stuff. Is there any? I'll obviously link your sort of research page into peer to people down below. But is there anything else you'd like to potentially point people to? Maybe any sort of books or some other works that you might be working on?
Um, well, not really. I'm in spite of appearing on a podcast list like this, I'm not a great self-publicist, to be honest. Some people might disagree, but that's my personal kind of view. Um, as I said, we've kind of been going through kind of a whole range of issues in a systematic fashion over the last 30 years. So we've got more and more specific in terms of the investigations and to what we've been tackling. Um, I mean, what I've been kind of really kind of interested in most recently is um, one, the impacts of tourism, particularly the negative impact, and secondly, environmental issues. And that has kind of dovetailed together. What I'm doing with the University of Aruba and also the Central Bank of Aruba is what we're actually looking at is um, the impact of the tourist sector on the Aruban economy. Okay, and one of the problems I did mention it earlier. Um, one of the problems is that it's a major source of employment, but also, and this is a particular problem in Aruba, but it's not unique in any way, is they have a large number of tourists, most of whom come from the United States. The rest come from mainly the Netherlands. Those tourists go to a hotel in Aruba, and don't talk to me about the architecture and stuff because I was horrified. Um, but they expect to consume American food and buy American goods and then leave.
Hmm.
So the hotel is generally owned by American companies. The airlines for the holidays are generally owned by American companies. The food that they consume is generally American and therefore has to be imported. And a lot of the goods they buy are made in America or China. So even though tourism is an important part of total economic activity in Aruba, the amount of value that is retained in Aruba is very, very small, but nobody knows how much. Nobody has done much in the way of analyzing this problem for any small economy for about 30 years. So we're working on that. Um, so tourists tourists leave very little value behind in terms of their spending power. It's all spent on imports. You then think about all the people that are employed in the tourism sector. Well, that's that's the majority of people working in Aruba. What do they spend their income on? They spend their income on consumption goods, which are imported from elsewhere in the Caribbean, the United States, and China.
Hmm.
So you can see that the value added, which is actually enhancing economic activity, is actually very, very low. And that's true for a lot of small economies. So the object of the kind of project is one, how much value added is actually retained in the Aruban economy? Secondly, much more importantly, how can we increase that domestic value added? Because that will have an impact on non tourism employment, non tourism production, and will actually deliver real growth to the economy.
Hmm. Yeah. No, it'd be an interesting piece of research, and I'll look forward to like sort of hearing sort of the findings on sort of what you come out with on those things. Robert, this has been great. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk. All academics love to talk about their research.
Well, it's been interesting either way, so I'm glad you've enjoyed it as well. Again, thank you much for your
Many
time.
thanks. Many thanks.